The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Let's start straight away.
Hello and welcome everybody. Good afternoon to today's webinar, which is Engaging Children as Partners in Practice to Support Their Mental Health and Wellbeing. That's quite a long and convoluted title, I know, but we're hoping very much that our three presenters today will be able to provide you with some clarity around how to work with children and make them genuine partners in that work. So my name is Dan Moss and I'm the Workforce Development Manager here at Emerging Minds as part of the National Workforce Centre for Children's Mental Health. And before we start today, I'd just like to acknowledge on behalf of Emerging Minds and CFCA to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our webinar presenters have participated and located. We wish to pay respects to the elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Indigenous Australians. So, moving on to our webinar series, and this is the second in a series of 6 webinars on children's mental health that will be facilitated in partnership between CFCA and Emerging Minds throughout 2018-19. We're really looking forward to the webinar in 2019 on February the 12th, which is how do we engage parents in conversations about the social and emotional well-being of their children. Again, a very long title, but that we're really looking forward to being able to bring you that webinar. So hopefully you can join us for that. So it is now my pleasure. So firstly, some housekeeping details. One of the core functions of the CFCA and the Emerging Minds, in this case, information exchange, is to share knowledge. So we would like to invite everyone to submit questions via the chat box at any time during the webinar. This webinar will be a little bit different in that our presenters will be taking questions from you throughout the presentation and also at the end. So we're looking forward to having what we say today really influence and improved by the questions that you ask. Please note that any unanswered questions may be published along with your name on the CFCA website for a response from the presenters after the webinar. Please let us know if you don't want your question or first name to be published on our website. We'd also like to continue the conversation we begin here today. And Chris will talk a little bit about how he'd like to continue that conversation later in the presentation. But to facilitate this, we've set up a forum on the CFCA website where you can discuss the ideas and issues raised, submit additional questions for our presenters, and access related resources. We will send you a link to the forum at the end of today's presentation. As you leave the webinar, a short survey will open in a new window. We would appreciate your feedback as a way of making us continue to improve what we present to you. Please remember that this webinar is being recorded and the audio, transcript and slides will be made available on the CFCA webinar and the CFCA YouTube channel soon. So, it's now my great pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce today's presenters. Firstly, we have Lisa Johnson, who's a psychologist and school counsellor. So Lisa, you currently work as a psychologist in a number of different roles, both face-to-face work with children and their families, in teaching and in supervision with other psychologists.
Yes, I do, and welcome everyone. So, yeah, I think on paper it probably looks like I work across some very diverse contexts at the moment. I meet with young folk from about 5 to 18 to 20 years old in a large school setting of 1,300 students, and I work with them and their teachers and families. And most of the teaching I do is mostly at the moment in university settings with people studying mental health, and the supervision work that I do is with colleagues who work at a place called STARS, which is a service for people who are living with the ongoing effects of trauma and torture on the foundation of the refugee experience. So whilst on paper they seem really diverse, to me they're incredibly linked. They go hand in hand. The work that I do and the experience of that work and the dilemmas informs the teaching and the supervision, and vice versa. So I'm not quite sure how I would do any of them on their own now, and that's what I'm up to these days. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that, Lisa. Next we have Dom Kleinig, who's a workforce consultant here at Emerging Minds. But Dom, you also have extensive experience working with children under 3 and their parents. And I'm just wondering, how's your practice developed in that space over the years?
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone. I think when I think about when I started as a beginning practitioner, there was often a question that would be asked of us, which was, who is the client? And that was often given to us to help us to clarify a difficult situation and give us a focus. But I think as I've moved to work in my work with parents and infants, and thanks to a lot of people that I've learnt from during that time, I come to really see that the concerns of infants affect their parents, and the concerns of parents affect infants, and that we can sometimes lean too heavily on the clarity that a question like that asks us and avoid making some really valuable contributions to infants and their parents. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dom. And lastly, Chris Dolman. Chris, you're the Child and Family Partnership Coordinator here at Emerging Minds. And you're looking very much at this concept of engaging children, but not only in practice, also in other ways. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. And hi, everyone. Yes, I've been speaking with other services in recent times about their practices for engaging children in service design and evaluation, to inviting children into a partnership around service design and review and evaluation, and really hearing about some sparkling practices that services are embarking on with that. And actually, for if there are sort of practitioners listening to this webinar that are engaging in that as well, we'd love here at Emerging Minds to hear from you. We'd love to be contacted by you and begin a conversation with you about how that's, how you are seeking to do that. So, yeah, certainly that's been taking up, my interest in recent times.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Very interesting work indeed. And yeah, thank you for that. Now we're going to go on to learning outcomes for today before we get started. And we've got 3 of those, and they're an understanding of the key intentions and purposes of building genuine partnerships with children and families in service provision, and the ethics that inform these endeavours. An exploration of some ideas and practices to support practitioners to build genuine partnerships with children. And that idea of genuine partnerships we're going to traverse a little bit today. And an introduction to some of the useful tools and processes that can be readily implemented by organisations to support practice. I'm now going to hand over to Chris to begin the formal part of today's presentation.
Thanks very much, Dan. Yes, so I'd like to, like us really to begin by taking a closer look at this concept of engaging children as partners in practice, and how that can provide a foundation for us to be responding to child mental health concerns. So firstly, but before we do that, let's just begin by thinking a bit about this task of engaging children in practice. I mean, this commonly happens, doesn't it, in settings that are quite unfamiliar for children, where they're required, it seems, to kind of speak with, adults they don't know about things they'd probably rather not talk about. Children, commonly know something's wrong and may even think that they are somehow complicit in this problem. It's kind of no wonder that children feel, unnerved and unsettled and become, perhaps very busy in response to that, or become quite quiet and feel silence and disempowered in that context, particularly, surrounded by adults, maybe 3 adults in the room with them, that are keen to help with them. And of course, they may also be bringing with them a history of speaking with adults about problems as well in all sorts of settings. So what is possible for engaging children as partners in practice, in this sort of context, in these circumstances? In first looking at this concept of engagement, we'd just like to flag a few aspects here that I'm only going to speak briefly to for today's webinar. Firstly, that engagement is not like a phase or a one-off, or it just happens in the initial stages of work, but is really an ongoing endeavour to build and maintain that therapeutic relationship with the child. That engagement means engaging with the whole child, engaging with the child as a person, not just the child in terms of the problem, but really engaging with the child in terms of what's in excess of the problem for the child, beyond the problem. What is it that we can be appreciating and understanding about the child in all of their aspects of life? But it does include engaging with the child in relation to the problems that they are facing. This is critical, we think, for, shaping the purposes of the work, for enabling collaboration with the child as well. And also, that engagement with children is possible when a context is created by the practitioner and their agency and parents for the child's meaningful and influential participation. So what we want to emphasise here is, if engagement, say, is not happening or whatever, let's focus on what the practitioner can do to create a context for that, to make engagement possible, rather than focusing perhaps on the child's shortcomings that are getting in the way. How can we be influential in this practice of engagement? In terms of this concept of partnership, what is it that needs to be in place? I mean, none of this is an exhaustive list. We're really just inviting you to think about some of these things. But certainly collaborative partnerships with children are characterised by a number of things, including shared understandings between the practitioner, the child, those that care for the child, in relation to the circumstances and concerns that surround the child and the family, and the purpose for the consultations as well. These conversations with children need to be resonant for the child. They need to be relevant to their everyday experience. They need to be linked somehow to the child's everyday experience. By partnership, we're also referring to conversations that draw on children's creativity and imaginations and interests. And also, that this notion of partnership is linked to an ethic of accountability to children's experience as well. Just in terms of practice, I guess, we have in mind, practices that have some sort of therapeutic intent, conversations that have some sort of therapeutic intent. Of course, engaging children as partners, as I've already mentioned actually in my introduction, can extend beyond that into other areas of service design and evaluation, but that's beyond what we're talking about today. I mean, why is it important to begin to engage children as partners in practice? Why is this important in supporting children's mental health? I mean, there are many reasons we could kind of offer for this, many different frames which we could look through, from a children's rights perspective, in terms of children's safety, from an early intervention lens, or, who is it that benefits from it? But really, I guess the main reason is because children tell us that this is important, and we want to highlight this. The children do have clear ideas about their participation in conversations with practitioners. If they've said, and some of the documents that record children's preferences are noted in our resources section for this webinar, but children have said, among other things, that they want opportunities to effectively participate in conversations and decisions that affect them. They want to not only have a voice, but to have their views heard and acknowledged and considered and respected. They like it when adults and professionals know when it's the right time to talk about challenging topics and the right amount of time to talk as well. Children like adults to be interested in what they're into, what they need, how they respond when things happen. They appreciate adults' interest in these areas of their life as well. They prefer to meet with professionals that take the time and effort to check the children's understanding, the child's perspectives of what's going on, asking about and acknowledging their experience, how it is for them as well. And they also children have said they like adults to recognise that they are capable, that they have ideas they'd like to explore, to work things out for themselves. So these are some reasons how come, it's important, I guess. So what does it take to engage children as partners in practice to support their mental health and well-being? We're going to talk about what we've called, or what we think of as 5 shifts in perspective and practice. Because to take children's sentiments seriously, in a way, these are kind of contrary to persistent messages in our society, actually, about children. About children, children's place, children's voices. I think this is something we can all reflect on, really, how children are positioned and portrayed in our society, in families, in our services, in our practice even. So I guess, we'd like to be inviting you to be considering these 5 overlapping shifts in order to effectively engage children as partners in practice. Of course, describing these shifts, we recognise that for many practitioners, many people there, that these shifts are already underway or well underway, are already evident in their practice. And so we'd love to hear from you about these endeavours and discoveries. I know you're hearing a lot from me so far, so I'm just going to introduce each one of these shifts, and then Dom and Lisa will be speaking a bit about how what these generate for their practice. The first one is really a shift from passive to active. What we mean by this is, shift is about a movement away from kind of societal ideas around seeing children as only, innocent and vulnerable and passive, towards regarding children as active in shaping their own lives. That they do possess an array of skills and know-how they've already drawn on. But these skills and know-how reflect their creativity and imagination as well, and that these don't exist in a vacuum, but these are often being formed in their communities, within their cultures as well, through their relationships with the people surround them as well. And that children are active in making meaning of their experiences as well, shaped by an assortment of values and ethics and hopes that guide them. So, in terms of this first shift, Dom, I was wondering, would you be able to speak to some of those, how this kind of plays itself out in your work with infants and children, under 3 also?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and I think in thinking about children under 3 as active participants, one of the major shifts that I think is really important in this is to see them as beings that have thoughts, feelings and needs and desires all of their own. As we try to make sense of infants' behaviour, holding this clearly in mind can start to build a much richer picture of the infant. And I think in those early years, one of the standout elements that we can kind of attend to is to understand that infants crying has meaning and kind of points to underlying states within themselves. And I think this is a tricky point probably to think about for parents as well, because when we hear about children crying, often we make sense of that in really fixed kind of ways, but to actually hold that in with some level of doubt that we can consider the meaning of a child that cries without necessarily blaming ourselves or being triggered by that or feeling that we need to be controlled by that. And I think those responses can unintentionally diminish the agency of an infant. So, yeah, just thinking about that as an infant as being responsive to his context, and that crying is a real marker of that. I think that would be my main point in that.
So what's standing out to me is, that last way you encapsulate that in children, infants being kind of responsive to their context in terms of being active, in their life as well. Yeah. So.
And I, whilst I'm working with older young people than infants, that word action really grabs my attention in thinking about what this shift invites in the work I'm doing with young people as well. And I'm always interested in thinking about what are the actions that I need to be taking? What do I need to be looking, sometimes actually searching for, to really create a space to start to support young people to regard themselves as being able to take action in their life? And I came across a set of words that I learnt from Maggie Carey, who works at Narrative Practices Adelaide, that have really stuck with me, and it's something I strive to hold on to in my work. And it's this notion of agency, as being sort of a term that can be used to describe this sense of taking action in one's own life, but agency as being about skills and knowledge in action. And I just find that so helpful, holding on to those three words, skills and knowledge in action. And it really supports me to really inquire into the skills that young people have and the knowledge that they have. So this might be knowledge they have about the problems that they're facing, what they're up against, what a concern looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like when it operates. But it may also be knowledge they have about things they like, things they don't like, how they would prefer things to be, and skills. Sometimes these skills might seem very disconnected to the problem, but they're almost always useful. They're the beginning point. But what I really appreciate about this word action is that I'm learning that if I only inquire into what young people or their families or their teachers know, and if I'm only inquiring into what their skills are, but I'm not also on a close lookout for actions that they're taking, times when they've put these skills into action, or times when this knowledge has been put into action, I can sometimes unintentionally leave young people as thinking of themselves as being active in their life, or at a kind of a thinking academic level, but not necessarily feeling that. And I think what I really love about this particular shift is it really is inviting from me, what I take about it is a sense of feeling active. It's an embodied kind of a feeling active. And so those three, being on the hunt for those three skills, knowledge in action, has been supporting me. It's something I'm striving to do.
And yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. What you and Dom have both spoken about is this idea of agency quite strongly around having conversations with children, which invites them into a sense of agency. But one of the things I'm interested in from both of you really is how, when you're working with a child and their parents, how do you connect a parent with this sense of agency in their child's life without necessarily stigmatising or shaming the child? Dom, is that something you'd like to answer first?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Look, and I think that critically in my work, that's something that has been addressed within, first of all, it starts with a stance that you actually acknowledge that the child has agency yourself, and I guess in the way that you act with that child, even in things like greeting both the parent and the child when they come to visit you or when you go to see them, that they're someone who is worthy of your attention and your focus as well, and that they can respond to that. The other part of that, I guess, is just to lift up the way that a child might be doing that with a parent. And I think for children, this is something that I would always be looking at, is for an infant, where are they looking? What are they interested in? How are they making a sense of what might be of this discussion that is going on between me and the parent? And taking moments out to say, what is this like for the child, and thinking about that, and thinking about putting their mind into the room as explicitly as possible. Yeah.
Thanks, Dom, and thanks, Lisa, for those reflections around practice in relation to this. The other shift we'd like to be speaking to is a shift from naive to knowledgeable. So this shift is about, like a movement away from, again, popular societal ideas about seeing children as kind of like naive and inarticulate about what's problematic in their life. A movement away from that and towards actually respecting them as knowledgeable about problems and solutions. This really reflects a perspective that children do possess, a lot of knowledge about the circumstances they're facing, the problems that they're facing, and that they can define and describe these, that they have the language and the meanings and the understandings. to define and describe these, and kind of deserve to be able to do so, really. This shift also requires that, I guess, practitioners take care to sort of privilege the language and the meaning making of the child, positioning them as experts or as consultants about the problems that they're facing as well. So Lisa, would you be able to begin to speak about how this kind of is present in your practice, in the different contexts in which you work? Yeah.
And I'm actually left thinking quite a bit about a few of the things that Dom just said, actually, in terms of the wonderful thing about these conversations and listening to each other's experiences, what it sparks in your own thinking. And I'm sort of captured by that term that you used, holding up. I think you used the word holding up, infants' knowledge or their sort of responses to what's happening in the room or what they prefer or don't prefer, and that's really ringing a bell for me when I think about some of the challenges that I've faced in supporting particularly some communities of young people and families who I've learnt are up against particular injustices, I think, particular vulnerabilities, I think, in sort of a less opportunity to have their knowledge held up. And what I'm have been reflecting on quite a bit and interested in lately is some things that I learned, particularly from my recent work at Novita, which is a service that provides support to children and young people with multiple disabilities, as well as my work at STARS, which we mentioned earlier, was just learning from some of these young folk and families that not only are there dominant ideas about what children do and don't know, generally speaking, or where their place is, as Chris said, in relation to resolving or having something to say about the difficulties in their life, but that there are some communities of young people and their families who I think are particularly vulnerable to being misunderstood as naive or misunderstood as not possessing knowledge, and that some of these ideas really set up the wrong impression, and they kind of seem to be based on dominant ideas of what people of knowledge do. What people of knowledge are able to do, how they communicate, what language people use. And these ideas seem to really set up the wrong impression, I think, that an unjust impression, that being articulate with words, particularly, for example, English words, is somehow a symbol of having knowledge. And I think this creates a real injustice for people who communicate in languages other than English, and also people who communicate without the spoken word. And I think particularly here of injustices that were made very aware to me from families in connection to my work at Novita, where many young folk were able to communicate in a range of diverse ways, but not using the spoken word. They may have been using communication devices or communication with their bodies, but many of these were really not recognisable to the neurotypical community, and so conventions around how to engage respectfully and directly with young people and their families facing these neurodiverse ways of communicating were so less familiar to people outside of these communities. And what I learned was that this really can result in particular communities of people being less consulted, perhaps being less understood, or even regarded as not being capable of possessing valuable knowledge. So perhaps being really held in this a misunderstanding of being naive. And I certainly have reflected on ways that I have unintentionally contributed to that in my work as well. And am really keen to strive towards thinking very carefully about the actions that I can take in my work to listen more closely and to look more broadly, so that I'm creating that context to elevate and really value the knowledge that is communicated by people and families across languages, across cultures, across modes of communication.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah, such interesting, I think, ideas around this kind of a broader understanding of knowledge has me thinking a bit about, for me to sort of really explore that, what I might end up kind of paying more attention to, actually, in my work with children as well. what I might end up noticing, paying more attention to, be curious about, I guess. So, so thank you for that. Yeah. We'd like to continue by introducing another shift around from, going back, this shift from, this shift is about a movement away really from ideas of seeing children as kind of passive recipients of services, where adults administer magical interventions, so to speak, mysterious interventions, towards positioning children actually as collaborators in the task of finding, tailored ways of responding to the problems at hand. So from seeing children as passive recipients of service to actually being active collaborators. Because children, it is possible for children to join with adults in kind of the co-generation of knowledge that can be applied not only to their circumstances, but are potentially helpful to others as well. So not just passive recipients, but actually collaborators and indeed contributors to others, their family members, practitioners, but also people perhaps they may never meet who are facing similar circumstances as well. Yeah. Dom, is this a shift that's somehow, informed the way you've worked with infants and young children?
Yeah, look, and when I think about this, this shift is really fundamental. I think in order to have children as contributors to the work and collaborators in what we're doing, there's this really essential thing, which is a constant work in slowing down to the pace of children or to the stage of their development in which things make sense to them. I think there's a really critical phrase for me which always sits in my mind, which is actually a program, but I'm not referring to the program. It's the idea of watching, waiting, and wondering, and it probably goes to another number of the other points that I've made. But when we watch and look for responses from children, we're choosing to see them, and that's an experience of giving them that we're listening, that we want, that what they have to contribute to a situation is important. And it's also necessary in order to do the work well. When we wait for children to contribute, then it shows that what they've got to contribute is valued. The other part, I think someone's given an interesting question through the webinar chat, and it's really around when children are maybe more passive in engaging and might want to sit back. And I think it's a wonderful question, because this idea that these things exist as overall thoughts and don't exist in a moment to moment kind of way, it would be false. And I think when we're working with children who might not want to engage, I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to work with that as something. When people want to sit back, or when children want to sit back, that there's something we can acknowledge their agency in doing that. And I think when it comes to infants, that the idea of where they're looking and what they're interested in and what's important for them in that moment is something that we really have to attend to. And I don't know whether you have thoughts on that one, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just really interested when you were talking about, I just had an image in my head of some of the young people I've worked with who've perhaps sat at the edge of a conversation. I'm particularly thinking of work in sort of really acute crisis contexts where perhaps young folk are really on the spot in meeting with someone like me, that there's not been it's not been possible to take sort of steps to prepare them for these conversations. And what I feel a bit clearer about from what you were saying is that this idea, for me, this idea of from recipient to contributor is different somehow, or not the same as thinking of young people as needing to be gregarious somehow, or needing to be really extroverted in their engagement, if you like. To me, it's a much more it speaks much more to the position and the interest and the effort that we take to bring forward their agency, their knowledge, their skills in action, and finding a way to bring this forward, not just so the young person experiences themselves as being knowledgeable, but that they get a sense of the purpose of that this is somehow not a task that can be. I've just been becoming more and more convinced that this is not a task that can be achieved in isolation, that this shift to contributor is less about engagement style, if you like, what it looks like, not about the way a young person performs in the conversation, but it's about the opportunities that are created for them to get a sense that whatever their contribution is in the conversation or in their lives, that this is somehow meaningful and purposeful beyond themselves. And so I've become really interested in finding ways to create an audience for them. And sometimes I'm always interested in the very many creative ways that practitioners do this, ways of collecting what they've learned from young folk so that they're able to then pass that down or somehow symbolically represent that in the organisational space. The structures that organisations can set up that from the get-go imply this is a place where the young people that we consult with have something to say that has ripple effects, that this will be held up and treated in a way that we know will make a difference to another. So there's something about the reciprocity in the response that we provide and what we make possible, I think.
And what is it you're hoping for children in making that clear, that reciprocal relationship clear?
Say that 5 times really quickly. I'm hoping that young people and their families and their community experience a couple of things. One, a sense of being linked to others, a sense of connectedness, a sense that their achievements, their knowledge, their being on this planet is not an isolated experience. So that what they have to say, what they have to contribute is linked to someone else, and that in this link there will be a ripple. It will strike a chord for someone else. It might inspire a new thought in someone else. It just might make sense to someone else. And so I think there's an ethic in there, but there's also a deeply practical intention, which is something about addressing, standing against the isolating impacts of problems. I think how often families that I meet with have come to feel incredibly isolated, incredibly at the wrong end of knowing what to do, somehow disconnected from other folk who seem to know better than perhaps they. And so bringing forward this sort of reciprocity, this really rich idea of being a contributor, I think can do something to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. That's a really great answer. And we're getting some great questions coming in through the chat box. We really invite you to keep those questions coming. One of the questions, particularly around or a couple of the questions, Dom, have been around contextual kind of examinations of this practice of moving children from recipients to contributors, maybe in instances where children are going through really acutely tough times. They might be in care, they might be going through some other maltreatment as a response to traumatic incidences. So in your work, how do you keep those kind of issues in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think the context is really important in all of that. I think the developmental lens, which I've talked a little bit about when you're thinking about infants, and thinking about the specific question, I think mentioned crisis care, that sense that where an infant's may not be in the care of its parents, and how you actually engage with a child that might not have and I guess what we need to understand about that is that an infant in that context is really separated from a primary source of making sense and creating safety in their world, and so that that's it could be a really vulnerable time for that infant. And I think some of those things that we've mentioned already, but just understanding that what the sensory world of that infant looks and feels like, and is it to have someone strange to be caring for that infant, could be who talks more deeply or more high pitched or touches them, moves them in a different way, more quickly or more slowly, that all of those things have an impact on a child's sense of safety. And I think if you're in that context, to be attuned to that, I'm not sure if there's anything more than that than I can actually say. Yeah.
Thank you, Dom and Lisa. We'd like to look at this other idea around a further shift from categories to context. So I guess this reflects like a movement away from from solely assessing the extent of children's congruence with mental health diagnostic categories, or other categories, I guess, that are used to group children and kind of put divisions between groups of children. So movement from that solely assessing that congruence, as important as helpful as that may be, but also, moving towards seeking to understand the child's views and experiences and evaluations of the broader context that surround them, the particular circumstances that they're going through, the relationships that surround them as well, to understand these, but how children also evaluate these. So yeah, again, Lisa, would that be something you could speak to as well in terms of your work with children in relation to this idea of a movement that doesn't just include a categorical kind of understandings of children's lives?
It feels like a really relevant and quite challenging, actually, shift for me to be stepping into in 2018. I hope I'm not alone. I suspect I'm not, in noticing some shifts around the language that is available in sort of, contemporary Australia to describe the particularly difficult circumstances or experiences we might be having. And I guess what I've noticed in particular over the last probably 10 years, but even more so over the last 6 or 7, is that it's not uncommon at all for me, particularly in a school setting, for the beginning point of me meeting a young person to start with the young person describing their problem or what they're up against, their concern, as something like anxiety, something like depression, bipolar disorder, and the children I have in mind when I'm saying this, I'm thinking 6 and 7-year-olds are not, in my experience, unfamiliar with some of these words. And that's something that's different now to what I would have found or did find in the beginning points of conversations, sort of 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. And I think that young people are coming across these words and often finding them quite helpful in some ways, that these terms have become available to them that perhaps were once relegated to medicine, have sort of slipped into everyday vernacular, is what I'm learning in the playground. And that often, particularly younger older people may have done some research and may be finding these words really helpful because it reflects some kind of sense of resonance, or, I've found what it is, what I'm up against. And so it makes sense to me why these terms are given to me when I meet with young people in their effort to have me understand what they're up against. But the challenge for me is that these terms seem to always only offer at best a half story, particularly at a beginning point. Because what seems to be less visible to the young person, and certainly to myself, if I don't look beyond that sort of categorical description of the concern, is the context. It's the circumstances of what they're up against. And when I'm interested in some of these other shifts that we've talked about, in bringing forward what young people know about the context of their lives, what actions they're taking in response to a problem, the kinds of circumstances that have given rise to the difficult feelings that they might be up against, I find myself needing to work much more in a much more determined way to be respectful of these categorical understandings that on one hand can be quite helpful, but also bring forward what else there is to know, which is going to be absolutely critical in being able to understand and then address the impact of the problem or concern. And also critical to elevating what it is a family knows about the young person, or what it is the young person themselves knows, because the terms, the words that they will come up with, the descriptions that they come up with that sit outside of medicine, in my experience, will always be richer and more specific and more particular to their context. And I find it almost impossible to do this work without getting that from young people, families and their communities. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Such a vital part, I think, of engaging children in practice, this sort of interest in the broader context and circumstances that surround them, that are perhaps complicit in the problems they're facing, as well as what it is that can enable them to respond to these problems. Okay, so we'd also like to be inviting folks to be thinking a bit about a shift in relation to accountability, really. So whilst there are hierarchical top-down accountabilities that practitioners have to their agency or to funding bodies, or certainly to salient evidence-based literature, all of this remains important. This shift is really also calling for a practice approach that is accountable and answerable to the child, as well as their parents and other concerned adults, of course. But in other words, accountable to those that are most affected by the problem, that are seeking conversations, that are seeking some support in relation to responding to these problems. And we can be thinking about this as a kind of bottom-up accountability as well. Again, Dom, could you speak to something about this in terms of your work with infants?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Thank you. I think the striking thing for me in working with infants is the rapid growth and development that they go through. From 1 month to the next, they can be, developing all new capacities that they never had. Anyone who has seen an infant through the first few years of life knows how quickly this can come, and I think that really speaks to the need for timeliness in engaging with families who have infants where there might be some kind of context that we can support them with, and so I think that one of the key messages from emerging minds around this is the need to intervene early in life, early in the life of the problem that we may be seeing them in, whether that's a drug and alcohol service, a DV service, or whatever your context. And also to be engaging with children early in the engagement that the family has with the service. I think that, I don't know what it's like for the rest of the panel, but as I get older, it seems easier to just think that, 1 month or 2 months has passed and it doesn't really matter. But when you're thinking about children, it's a huge chunk of time and life that happens.
Thank you for that, Dom. Now we're getting towards the end of our presentation, and we've got some time for some questions from the audience. And in the chat box, there's a couple of people who have asked about how can mental health or social services organisations be assisted really to be providing these practices with children and their families? How can individual practitioners in organisations be supported through supervision and other mechanisms to be able to make these 5 practice shifts? Chris, I know that you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And this is certainly an important consideration, and we were hoping to speak to some of these themes as part of our presentation today. In fact, I might use the slide we prepared as a way of answering that question or structuring an answer to that question. And so I think so relevant, isn't it? So rather than just putting the gaze solely on practitioners and practitioner skills around engaging children as partners in practice, what is it that organisations can do to make this more and more possible? And it is possible for organisations to be influential in this way, really through the development, I think, of real robust organisational processes, which can really span a whole lot of different organisational practices. Even I think think of right from recruitment, actually. From how positions or jobs are advertised or spoken about. Where there is a naming of a focus on working with children, on children's mental health and social and emotional well-being. Position descriptions, that actually explicitly include these things, include a focus around engaging children as partners in practice as well, all provided this kind of structural support for practitioners to be doing that. Things like interview questions and vignettes and interview inquiries can be, can really create a culture in an organisation that engaging children as partners in practice is important. Not just in recruitment, but right through their process through induction as well, where there can be clear expectations met and clear statements made about the support that will be provided through the induction process for practitioners around these practices as well. And when I'm talking about recruitment and induction, I'm not just referring to staff that work directly with families, with children and families, but actually those at supervision or managerial level as well. It can kind of permeate the organisation. This as well. And through the description of what's sometimes called competencies, the skills that practitioners need to bring to bear in their work as well. There can be descriptions of the actual particular skills that are required or that will be supported by the organisation. And when I'm saying supported by the organisation, I guess I'm primarily referring to supervision practices as well. But, a focus on children's mental health and well-being or practice of engaging children, even in services that focus mostly on adults and adult problems. This can be part of supervision contracts, and what it is that we're going to talk about in supervision. The kind of examples, if you like, the case examples that practitioners bring to supervision that they're wanting consultation around. This can be set up as just as kind of what we do around here. And again, further reinforced through, client case review practices as well. But also, how is it that we can, organisations can be engaging children in the evaluation of services that either they're receiving, or even what is it that's possible in terms of how can children be engaged in evaluating services that those that care for them are receiving as well. So look, there are many different ways that organisations can be supportive of practitioners to be doing the best they can, drawing on all their skills to engage children as partners in practice. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got some really great questions coming through the chat box, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those as we can. Lisa, a question for you around what Chris was talking about in terms of how do we provide this shift in organisations, and there was a question around whether the flattening of hierarchy within organisations is something that is a possible way to do this.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that's raised a theme, I think, that's caught my interest around accountability, and a particular question around that has me reminded of some of the dilemmas when we may be meeting with a young person or a family, or I even think of requests that might come my way from colleagues, where there may be a request or a hope or an expectation that does not fit with what it is that perhaps I'm able able to provide, or perhaps that sits within what's expected of me from a legal perspective or from an organisational perspective. And what I appreciate about this question around how do we understand people's expectations and manage these in the context of accountability, it sort of reminds me that this shift, which in the slide is described as from top down to bottom up. I'd like to be a little controversial and propose some other language that this questioner has had me thinking about, and it's sort of a flattening of the hierarchy. So rather than kind of proposing, which I don't think this shift is not, I think this shift is not proposing an upending of the hierarchy, where somehow whatever it is that a young person knows or expects is automatically at the top of the hierarchy, and that perhaps a practitioner or an organisation or a law is at the bottom of that hierarchy. I guess what I appreciate about this shift is that there's an invitation to perhaps what I find helpful to think about flattening that hierarchy, so that multiple voices, multiple perspectives can be heard, can be investigated, can be weighed up, and in that way, I think we're better able to understand what it is that young people expect, that they have a voice at that table, but that we also have a voice at that table, so that those multiple hopes, knowledges, expectations can be equally valued, if you like, or equally explored. So yeah, appreciate that question.
Thank you, Lisa. Not controversial at all. I think very wise answers. So thank you. Dom, a question for you. How do we support parents to hear their children's experiences in deep and rich ways, but for the children not to be left alone to make adult decisions?
I think that's a really good question, and one that's really fundamental to anyone who cares for children in any kind of way. It seems to me that the risk of elevating children's status too high is that we give them the sense that they're in charge of everything, and that and it's something that stretches them beyond what they're capable of bearing. That rather than stretching them, we break them. And I think there's something in that if a child feels like they don't have the opportunity to shape that, or to even say this is too much for me, then that's a real risk that we run. In terms of children, I think understanding that they will preference particular individuals that they trust to be able to help them to make the decisions that they can't make on their own. And I guess part of that is to be really clear about what kind of impact the parent has on their child, and what the sweet spot is for a child based on their developmental stage as well. I think that changes so rapidly. To speak about that specifically probably isn't possible.
Thanks, Dom. That's a really great answer. I really appreciate that. Okay, we're moving towards the end of our webinar. It's been, I'm sure everyone will agree, the richness of the discussion and the responses from our three panelists have been amazing. So thank you to Lisa, Dom and Chris. And before they leave us today, I'm going to invite them just for a quick last thoughts really about what they're most passionate about in moving forward in the 5 shifts that they've talked about. So we might start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's last thoughts or just ongoing thoughts really, but I think yes, hopefully not last thoughts. I think what I'm most passionate about is actually how these shifts really do reflect a repositioning of children in our society. You know, and that as practitioners and as services, you know, we can contribute to a revaluing of children, you know, a regrading of children rather than a degrading of children, I think, in our society. And we can play our part in that through the ways we have these conversations with people, with families, with children. So yeah, that's what I'm most passionate about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that question just goes to some of the core of where I got it, why I got into this work in the first place as a passionate young social worker, and really concerned about justice and the idea that when we can put children's voice into the centre of, and I think it's wonderful with the work of Emerging Minds in looking at the workforce and social services, health services, community services, reorientating to put children in the middle. But I'm really excited about the idea that we can do that more broadly as a society in terms of how we plan and think about the future and think about what we want for our country. I think there's a lot. I mean, you can get me on my soapbox all day with that question, but I think that it is quite an exciting ethic to embrace.
I think the word that comes into my mind is striving, like a sense of just being excited about continuing to strive to work really hard. And I use the word hard not meaning difficult, but diligent and sort of sweating from the bottom of my feet at times to make it possible for children, including the very young, across languages, across modes of communication, to reconnect with what it is they know, what it is they hope, and steps that they can take. Yeah.
Thank you once again to Lisa, Dom and Chris, and thank you for everyone for attending today. So please follow the link on your screen to our website to continue this conversation. And as Chris has mentioned, really we just feel like that this is the beginning of a conversation for us at Emerging Minds, and we'd feel very privileged to be able to continue this conversation around these crucial shifts and other important thoughts about working with children and their families. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you for all the wonderful questions, and we'll see you next time for our Emerging Minds and CFCA webinar on February the 12th. Thank you.